What could possibly drive Prince William, once the picture of patience and diplomacy, to sever all ties with Queen Camilla's family? The answer lies in a revelation so shocking, it has the power to unravel decades of royal deception. For years, the monarchy has thrived on the illusion of unity, presenting itself as an unshakable institution built on tradition, honor, and continuity. But beneath the grandeur, William has watched quietly as fissures widened, tensions deepened, and shadows grew darker. For the world, he was the dutiful heir, careful never to overstep, cautious to avoid public confrontation. Yet, in one thunderous move, that mask of restraint shattered. With uncharacteristic ruthlessness, William stripped Camilla's family of their privileges, titles, and royal access. The decision was neither gradual nor discreet. It was delivered with precision, calculated to leave no doubt as to who was truly in control of the monarchy's future. The news erupted across the palace with the force of a bomb. Whispers spread through Clarence House corridors before the official statement even reached the press. Staff, who had long grown accustomed to the quiet entitlement of Camilla's children and grandchildren, found themselves staring at sudden exclusion orders, their names scrubbed from official lists, their presence unwelcome at events they once attended with ease. Shock hardened into disbelief. Some called William merciless. Others quietly admitted they had seen the storm brewing for years. Yet, no one could deny the brutal clarity of his act. William had drawn a line in the sand, one that even the king himself had hesitated to trace. Camilla's family was blindsided. Laura Lopes, Camilla's daughter, who had long cherished her quiet role away from the spotlight, was devastated. Tom Parker Bowles, often criticized for his subtle exploitation of the royal connection, suddenly found his career and reputation cut off from the prestige it leaned upon. The grandchildren, still too young to grasp the full weight of what had been done, would grow up knowing they had been locked out of the palace forever. It was not merely a political decision. It was a message, seared into the very fabric of the monarchy, that William would no longer tolerate shadows encroaching upon the future he envisioned for his own children. The media descended with ravenous hunger, sensing blood in the water. Headlines declared William's cold defiance, his sudden transformation into a man who would no longer be overshadowed by compromise. Pundits debated whether the king was too ill or too cautious to intervene. Some speculated Charles had secretly sanctioned William's decision. Others argued he was simply powerless to stop it. The silence from the throne only deepened the chaos, fueling theories that this was not William acting alone, but William acting with a ghostly partner whose memory still haunted the monarchy: his mother, Diana. For supporters of the late Princess of Wales, this act was poetic justice. For Camilla's defenders, it was cruelty cloaked as reform. Inside the palace, the sense of dread was unmistakable. William had acted swiftly, but the weight of his decision carried echoes of something larger, something more dangerous. Staff whispered that William's confidence came not from instinct alone, but from knowledge that had been passed to him from a voice the palace thought long silenced. The chill of this possibility left even senior courtiers unsettled. If true, then William's act was not just about cutting ties. It was about exposing a secret that had festered for decades, waiting for the moment to erupt. And so, the world stared, stunned, at the heir who had transformed overnight into a decisive executioner of royal ties. It seemed ruthless, even uncharacteristic, but beneath his resolve was a truth William had yet to reveal. A truth that promised to upend not only Camilla's family, but the entire institution itself. The monarchy's carefully built facade had cracked, and the echo of betrayal was only beginning to sound. But to understand William's drastic move, we must go back to the man who once knew Camilla more intimately than anyone else. Her former husband, Andrew Parker Bowles. For years, Andrew Parker Bowles kept his silence, burying secrets that could have shattered the monarchy. But now, in a moment no one expected, he finally breaks his vow, and his words send shockwaves straight into Buckingham Palace. Andrew had been more than a husband to Camilla. He had been a witness, an accomplice, and, in the end, a victim of her ambition. Their marriage had begun with the warmth of youthful affection, but it slowly dissolved into betrayal, whispered affairs, and a sense that something much larger was always looming behind her eyes. He watched her slip through the cracks of propriety, forging ties that would eventually bind her to a destiny neither of them could have imagined. And though Andrew chose silence after their divorce, he carried with him truths that festered in the shadows of the crown. Now, decades later, that silence has broken. In hushed, carefully guarded conversations, Andrew delivered what many now call his explosive confession. Words he had once held back out of loyalty or perhaps fear spilled into private circles with devastating force. He confessed to knowing of Camilla's relentless pursuit of influence, even while bound by vows to him. He admitted that, in his own weakness, he turned a blind eye to her calculated moves, knowing she was weaving herself deeper into the royal web. But what left listeners stunned was the clarity with which he spoke, not bitter, not angry, but heavy with the weight of regret. He had enabled her. He had stood aside, watching her carve a path toward power, and in doing so, he had helped create the very storm, now consuming the monarchy. What Andrew revealed next was darker still. He spoke of private conversations where Camilla had dismissed the idea of a quiet life, insisting that she was meant for more. He described the subtle manipulations she employed, bending not just Charles, but entire circles of influence around her charm. His words were not wild accusations, but cold, deliberate recollections, delivered with a precision that cut deeper than any rumor ever could. Those present knew immediately that these revelations were more than gossip. They were the kind of truths that could collapse reputations, unravel marriages, and taint the crown itself. The weight of these confessions did not remain hidden for long. As if by design, they reached William. The future king sat and listened as Andrew's testimony was relayed, each detail confirming suspicions he had carried in silence for years. For William, this was not merely about Camilla's past. It was about the present scandals that seemed to haunt his family with cruel persistence. Andrew's words stitched together the threads, connecting Camilla's history of manipulation to the turmoil now poisoning the monarchy. And in those moments, William understood why he could no longer stand idle. The confession was not just an echo of the past. It was a warning for the future. Andrew himself issued that warning in stark, unforgettable terms. He told those who would listen that the monarchy was at risk of being poisoned from within. He did not name Camilla directly, but the implication was unavoidable. His voice, heavy with the knowledge of decades, carried a gravity that even skeptics could not dismiss. Here was a man who had lived at her side, who had seen her climb from the quiet shadows of society to the throne itself, now sounding the alarm that the crown's very survival was at stake. William, already torn between duty and emotion, now had a weapon he could wield, a truth that justified his ruthless decision to cut ties with Camilla's family. This was not a prince acting out of vengeance. It was a man fulfilling what he believed to be his responsibility to protect the monarchy from collapse. Andrew's confession became the turning point, the spark that ignited William's fury into decisive action. What exactly did Andrew say that made William take the most drastic step of his royal career? The answer lies in a web of betrayal that begins long before Camilla entered the palace. Behind the gilded palace gates lies a hidden web of betrayal, where loyalty is fleeting, secrets are currency, and one misstep can destroy a crown. Andrew Parker Bowles's confession did more than peel back the veil on Camilla's ambitions. It revealed the darker truth of how those ambitions had been nurtured, protected, and ultimately rewarded. He spoke with the candor of a man who had nothing left to lose, admitting that even during their marriage, Camilla's gaze was fixed not on love, but on power. She moved through society not as a wife content with her role, but as a strategist, every conversation and connection carefully designed to elevate her closer to the throne. Andrew described her determination as relentless, an unstoppable current that pulled everything around her into its path. In his chilling recollection, Andrew revealed that he himself had been little more than a stepping stone. He admitted that Camilla used his status and his connections to enter royal circles, to establish herself as indispensable among the very people who would one day hold her fate in their hands. What he once mistook as charm or sociability, he now understood as calculation. She knew where to be, who to flatter, and which doors to push open. And Andrew, blinded by loyalty or perhaps pride, allowed it. He now confessed to being complicit in her rise, standing silently as she maneuvered herself deeper into the monarchy's inner sanctum. But Andrew's revelations did not stop at Camilla's ambition. He suggested that her entire family reaped the rewards of her relentless climb. From subtle favors to advantageous opportunities, Camilla's children and relatives benefited from connections forged in palace corridors. Andrew described a pattern, one where personal ambition bled into family advancement, each success reinforcing the hold they gained on the royal structure. It was not simply Camilla's ascent that haunted him, but the legacy she built for her bloodline. A legacy that, in his eyes, corrupted the balance of power within the monarchy. What weighed most heavily on Andrew's voice was his regret that he had remained silent for so long. He admitted that there were moments when he could have spoken, when he could have warned those around him of what was unfolding. But fear, pride, and the desire to avoid scandal kept him muted. Now, he described his silence as a betrayal of his own conscience, one that had allowed Camilla's reach to grow unchecked. And in his words, William saw more than history. He saw the present danger staring back at him. For William, the confession was not simply a tale of the past, but a revelation of the threats that lingered still. He realized with growing clarity that Camilla's family's presence within the palace was not harmless but corrosive, a continuation of the same influence Andrew had described decades earlier. The idea that Catherine and his children could one day be overshadowed, manipulated, or undermined by this lingering web of connections was intolerable. The seeds of fury began to sprout within him, no longer just as a son protecting his father's throne, but as a husband and father defending his own family's future. And so, the betrayal Andrew described did not stay locked in dusty memories. It took root in the present, its poison dripping steadily into William's resolve. Every word Andrew spoke seemed to harden his determination, turning whispers of doubt into vows of action. The past was no longer past. It was a living wound that threatened the monarchy's very survival. But betrayal inside the monarchy doesn't just end with whispers of the past. It bleeds into the present, fueling a dangerous power struggle between William and Camilla. As William's wrath grows, Camilla's once privileged family suddenly find themselves stripped of everything they thought untouchable. But their desperate pleas only make the storm worse. What began as murmurs of discontent within the palace became a brutal declaration. Camilla's children and their descendants would no longer benefit from the monarchy's power or wealth. Royal patronages, once granted as tokens of legitimacy, were revoked overnight. Financial privileges that had flowed quietly through unseen channels were cut off without hesitation. What had once seemed secure as an inheritance of access, prestige, and influence crumbled in the span of a single royal order. The shock hit hardest at the heart of Camilla's family. Laura Lopes, who had chosen a quieter life away from the glaring spotlight, found herself dragged unwillingly into the storm. The insulation she had relied on for decades vanished, exposing her to a wave of humiliation and loss. Tom Parker Bowles, accustomed to moving through elite society under the shield of royal ties, was devastated. His career, often whispered to be bolstered by proximity to the crown, now stood vulnerable, stripped of its silent endorsements. What was once privilege had become a burden, a public symbol of the family's fall from grace. Even the youngest were not spared. The grandchildren, still too innocent to understand the cruelty of power, suddenly faced a future severed from the opportunities that had seemed their birthright. Their place in ceremonies, their access to tradition, their inheritance of royal favor, all gone. They were cast into uncertainty, not as heirs to a protected legacy, but as bystanders of a war they never chose. It was a generational break, a decision that ensured Camilla's bloodline would never again carve influence into the monarchy's core. Camilla's fury was volcanic. Behind closed doors, she confronted William with a venom he had long anticipated but never before witnessed. Her voice, once the polished tone of a queen consort, cracked with rage as she accused him of cruelty, betrayal, and vindictiveness. She demanded answers, demanded loyalty, demanded that he recognize her family as part of the royal whole. But William did not bend. His voice, measured yet unyielding, delivered the justification she feared most. Andrew Parker Bowles's confession. He cited the damning words of her former husband as proof that her family's influence was a danger to the very survival of the crown. What she dismissed as ancient grievances, William declared as living threats. And then came the words that froze the air. "This ends now." With that chilling warning, William drew a line not only against Camilla's family, but against every shadow of ambition they represented. It was not just an ending, it was an execution of their future within the monarchy, carried out by the man destined to rule. Yet while William was determined to end Camilla's family's influence, He underestimated how far she would go to fight back. Humiliated and cornered, Camilla launches a desperate counterattack, determined to protect her family's legacy, even if it means going against the future king himself. Stripped of the power she had spent decades consolidating, she refused to accept defeat quietly. The queen consort, accustomed to commanding influence behind the throne, was not prepared to watch her children and grandchildren be erased from royal privilege. In a storm of emotion, she gathered her allies, both within the palace walls and across the broader aristocratic world. Longtime confidants, sympathetic courtiers, and political figures she had carefully cultivated over the years were suddenly pulled back into her orbit. She sought to build a coalition, a force that could stand in defiance of William's brutal decree. But her greatest weapon was the king himself. Tearful, vulnerable, yet burning with desperation, Camilla appealed directly to Charles. She framed William's actions as betrayal, not only of her, but of him, arguing that allowing her family to be cast out was an insult to his authority as monarch. In private, she begged for intervention, using every emotional tool at her disposal. Charles, weary and fragile, found himself caught in an impossible bind. The woman he had fought to legitimize, to crown, and to protect, was asking him to defend her against his own heir. Yet, William, his son, spoke with the cold conviction of destiny, declaring that the monarchy's survival demanded it. Charles's silence deepened the rift, making the palace feel less like a home and more like a battlefield. Outside those walls, the storm grew louder. Strategic leaks painted William as heartless, the media running headlines that framed him as a merciless son turning against his stepfamily. Stories of Camilla's grandchildren being cast out into exile tugged at public sympathy, while commentators speculated whether William's hardline stance risked turning the people against him. Though William remained composed in public, the attack was calculated, designed to fracture his image of compassion and weaken his support before he ever reached the throne. Every front page, every panel discussion, was another blow in Camilla's counteroffensive. Yet, even as she pushed outward, Camilla hinted at an even darker weapon in her arsenal. Behind closed doors, she warned William that if he continued his purge, she would be forced to reveal secrets of her own truths, buried deep. Truths that could tarnish not just reputations, but the monarchy itself. Whether bluff or reality, the threat hung heavy, leaving courtiers shaken and William enraged. It was no longer a private dispute. It was an open declaration of war inside the House of Windsor, a line drawn that neither side could cross without destroying the other. The royal family, once fractured by scandal, was now fully at war with itself. And as battle lines hardened, it became clear that Camilla would not surrender quietly. She was prepared to scorch the very earth beneath her if it meant protecting her bloodline from total erasure. But what Camilla didn't anticipate was that Andrew Parker Bowles had not yet revealed the darkest part of his confession. Just when the palace believed Andrew had said it all, a second confession emerges, one that paints Camilla's rise to power in an even darker light. If his first revelations shook the monarchy, his second tore through it like an earthquake, dismantling whatever fragile illusions remained. Andrew, once a man content to shield the past behind silence, now admitted the unthinkable. He had covered for Camilla, hiding dealings that could have ended her ascent before it even began. With the calm resolve of someone burdened by guilt, he confessed to concealing truths, orchestrating distractions, and ensuring scandals never reached the ears of those who could have stopped her climb. In doing so, he had become not just her husband, but her enabler, a silent architect of the very chaos now consuming the monarchy. Among the most shocking details was the suggestion of private arrangements, benefits funneled to her family at the monarchy's expense. Andrew described how favors were exchanged quietly, behind closed doors, ensuring that Camilla's children and relatives gained advantages they would never have achieved otherwise. Whether financial or social, these arrangements bolstered their influence, weaving them further into the structure of privilege. It was no accident, he claimed, that her family had flourished, even as others withered under scrutiny. What seemed like luck or circumstance was, in truth, a calculated strategy, one he now admitted to shielding from exposure. But perhaps the most devastating revelation was his acknowledgement of how Camilla manipulated Charles's vulnerabilities during their courtship. Andrew recounted how she recognized the cracks in Charles's spirit, how she exploited his longing for affection and his insecurities about duty. Every whisper, every carefully chosen word, every display of empathy was not mere affection, but a calculated move to bind him tighter to her influence. Andrew admitted that while he once dismissed these tactics as the normal complexities of relationships, he now saw them for what they were: tools of power. Sharpened and wielded with precision, his remorse was palpable, his words soaked in regret. He described himself as a man who failed to intervene, who chose silence over truth, and in doing so, allowed Camilla's path to the throne to remain unchallenged. He spoke of sleepless nights, haunted by the image of Diana, of how he had watched her suffer, knowing that the very machinations he had helped conceal contributed to her torment. To hear him say it aloud was to strip away decades of denial, leaving behind only the raw truth of his complicity. For William, these revelations deepened the horror. It was no longer just about Camilla's ambitions, it was about the pain inflicted on his mother. Andrew's confession connected the threads, showing how Diana's anguish had not been born of chance, but of deliberate manipulation. Each word seared into William's resolve, transforming grief into righteous fury. And as his conviction grew, so too did the world's sympathy. The public, long divided in their loyalties, began to rally behind William and Catherine. His mother's suffering had been vindicated, and his stance against Camilla's family began to feel less like ruthlessness and more like justice. The confession became the final nail in the coffin for Camilla's family, but the war inside the palace was only beginning. For William, this wasn't just about Camilla, it was about his mother, Diana. And in one decisive move, he vowed to protect her legacy at all costs. The memory of his mother's suffering had never left him. It haunted his quiet moments, lingered in his thoughts during state occasions, and fueled the determination with which he approached his duty. Now, as Camilla's family pushed back against his authority, William drew strength from the image of Diana, not as a distant figure of the past, but as a guiding presence that demanded justice. He would not allow her memory to be trampled, nor would he permit those she once viewed as the architects of her pain to retain influence over the monarchy his children would inherit. By his side, Catherine's support was unshakable. The palace was no longer a home, but a battlefield, filled with whispers of betrayal and the heavy tension of divided loyalties. Yet, Catherine stood firmly beside her husband, projecting quiet strength even as the conflict consumed the family. She understood what was at stake, not only William's legacy as a future king, but also the protection of George, Charlotte, and Louis from the same cycles of pain that had scarred their grandmother. Where William drew strength from his mother's memory, Catherine provided the resolve to turn that grief into action. Together, they became a united force, unwilling to bend under pressure, unwilling to compromise with those who sought to rewrite history for their own gain. It was in this crucible of conflict that William made his most powerful declaration. With the same conviction that once defined Diana's defiance, he declared his duty to protect his children from Camilla's influence. He spoke not as a son or a husband, but as a father and heir, determined to draw a line that would safeguard the monarchy's future. His words carried the weight of both past and future, echoing through the palace with a finality that silenced even his fiercest critics. He would not allow Camilla's family to shape the destiny of his heirs. To him, this was more than a personal feud. It was a battle for the survival of Diana's legacy and for the crown itself. In the eyes of many, William's stand was more than decisive leadership. It was poetic justice. The symbolism was undeniable. The son of Diana standing firm against the very family that had risen in her shadow was a moment the world could not ignore. Every act of defiance, every privilege stripped from Camilla's bloodline, was seen as an act of retribution for a mother's suffering. Supporters of Diana hailed William's decision as the long-overdue vindication she had been denied in life. The future king, they said, was restoring balance not only to the monarchy, but to history itself. Even within the royal family, quiet shifts began to occur. Princess Anne, ever pragmatic and fiercely loyal to the monarchy's stability, began to side quietly with William. Her support was subtle but unmistakable, signaling to those watching that the battle lines had shifted irreversibly. Camilla was no longer confronting just William, but a growing faction within the family that recognized the dangers of her influence. The divide deepened, and with it, the realization that this conflict was not temporary. It was the beginning of a transformation that would shape the monarchy's future. Foreshadowing lingered like a storm on the horizon. William's stand was not just about one decision or one moment. It was a declaration that could redefine the monarchy itself. His fight against Camilla's family was rapidly becoming more than personal vengeance. It was evolving into a struggle that might permanently reshape the crown's power, its traditions, and its very survival. But as William hardened his stance, Camilla prepared for her most ruthless move, yet one that could shatter the royal family's image completely. The palace has seen scandals before, but never a war like this. Camilla and William are locked in open confrontation, with Charles trapped in the middle as the monarchy trembles on the brink. What had begun as whispers of resentment now exploded into open hostility, with no attempt left to hide the divisions tearing through the royal household. Behind closed doors, William and Camilla faced each other in confrontations that courtiers described as volcanic. William's words were sharp, his tone unflinching, each statement striking like a hammer against the fragile walls of tradition. Camilla, defiant and wounded, fought back with every ounce of her authority, her voice rising with the desperation of someone who knew her entire family's future hung in the balance. Their battles were no longer hidden. They were felt in every corridor, every chamber, every silence that echoed after the shouting stopped. Charles stood at the center of this storm, crushed under the weight of divided loyalties. Torn between the woman he had crowned as his queen and the son destined to succeed him, the king's health and spirit began to falter. Those closest to him whispered of sleepless nights, of moments where he broke down under the pressure, admitting that the very crown he had spent his life preparing for now felt more like a curse. His inability to mediate only deepened the rift, making it clear that there would be no compromise. The king's silence was no longer seen as neutrality. It was weakness, and in that weakness, both Camilla and William pushed harder. The chaos did not stop with the royals themselves. Royal staff, long accustomed to weathering storms of scandal, began to resign in waves. For them, the environment had become intolerable, poisoned by loyalty tests, secrecy, and an atmosphere so charged it felt combustible. Their departures became yet another symbol of collapse, feeding the media frenzy outside the palace gates. The monarchy, once a fortress of endurance, appeared to be crumbling from within. The public, too, became divided. Some rallied to William, seeing in him the strength of his mother's legacy and the determination of a king who would not be manipulated. Others stood by Camilla, sympathizing with her as a woman being humiliated and stripped of dignity by the very family she had married into. The streets echoed with debates, the newspapers flooded with headlines, and social media exploded with vitriol. Each faction, certain their side, represented justice. What was once a private feud had become a spectacle for the entire world to witness. Beyond Britain, the story spiraled into international obsession. Foreign press outlets framed it in stark, brutal terms: the monarchy's civil war. Commentators speculated about abdications, collapses, and the possibility that the monarchy might not survive this unrelenting fracture. Every photograph of William and Camilla was dissected, every silence from Charles interpreted as either complicity or despair. The monarchy was no longer just a family in crisis. It was an institution teetering on the edge of ruin. In the midst of this firestorm, William delivered words that sent a chill through the palace. This is only the beginning. His declaration was not a warning but a promise that he would not stop until Camilla's influence was eradicated, that the war she had begun would end only when one side was destroyed. It was a vow that marked the point of no return. And then, in a moment no one saw coming, Camilla made her final, tearful gamble, one that would either save her family or destroy them forever. In her final, desperate act, Camilla makes a last stand against William's decision, but the outcome leaves the entire monarchy forever changed. Broken by humiliation, she collapsed before Charles in an emotional breakdown, pleading for him to intervene, to protect her family from being erased. With trembling hands, she produced a secret letter, one she claimed held truths that could shift the balance in her favor, a final weapon drawn from the shadows of the past. Yet even this desperate gamble failed. Charles, weary and torn, refused to defy his son, knowing the monarchy could not withstand another fracture. Camilla's attempt at leverage dissolved into silence as her last hope slipped away. With the king's quiet acquiescence, her family was officially stripped of all duties, privileges, and financial ties to the crown. William stood victorious, not triumphant, but cold. His victory symbolic of a new era, defined by his unflinching resolve. Still, the air was heavy with foreboding, for even in triumph, the scars of this war would linger. The monarchy itself seemed fractured beyond repair, and whispers grew louder that it may never fully recover from the devastation. And so, William's ruthless decision echoed far beyond the palace walls, forever altering the destiny of the House of Windsor. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.